this is going to be a very short clip, I hope, about how I do bias on a Scrubs V neck. There's lots of different ways of doing it. This just happens to be the way I do it, which I find quite helpful. So I start with the pattern, just the front, and I do the prep before I do anything else. And the first thing I do is with a biro and a see-through ruler, I'm going to mark the seam allowance into a small V. I'll pause whilst I do that and then show you what I've done. And there we have it. You can see I've started a couple of inches up, done one line, then I've come down the other side, and I've got the crossing point, and it's important to establish that. Because the bias won't show, I'm actually going to use some bias left over from one of the previous tops I've done, just because I know I've got a lot of it and it's quite nice. It will tuck away. One of the nice things about doing the necks this way is that you don't actually need to interface it. If I was making this with a lighter weight or maybe looser woven fabric, I might put a little square of very lightweight interfacing just to strengthen this bit, and you'll see why in a minute. If I needed bias, I tend to do it this way, and what you can see I've got is a kind of lozenge shaped piece of fabric where I've drawn lines for the bias, and what I'll do is I will bring the lines together so that one edge is hanging. Once you've sewn it, then you actually just cut it like a spiral and you end up with lots and lots of bias. I'm doing two tops at the moment. The other one's a navy, so whilst I'm doing this, I'll get the other bias ready. And then I haven't used a fancy bias maker or anything. Don't need to for this. I've just folded it in half and pressed it carefully so that I've got the seam. Makes it a bit easier to use. Right, so I'm going to pause again, do the next step, and then show you what I'm doing next. Right, so you can see I've stitched now with a shortish stitch to the V, needle in, turned back up the other side, and I've pulled both the threads through to the wrong side, so they're tucked out of the way. I'm now going to machine the shoulder seams, finish them, and then stitch them together. So that's my next step. Okay, so I have stitched the shoulders. My overlocker's not working at the moment, so I've stitched, pinked the edges, and then I have stay stitched the seam to the back to keep it nice and neat. And now I'm going to go on to the next bit. The V that we sewed earlier on, I have cut right down to the stitching, so you can see why that stitching is so important now. And the navy bias, actually there's loads of it, so rather than that flowery stuff, I'm going to use this navy bias for the next step. So what I'm going to do is, working from the right side, I am going to pin this bias in place so that we're down from here, because our stitching is going to start here. So I'm a little bit down from there, and I am going to lay it so the raw edges meet here, and then it continues in a straight line, and I will pin it to keep it in place as near to that V there as I can to keep some control. and then I will work all the way round. I'll ease it round the neck. Once I've done it, I'll show you what I mean, and come down to the other side. Again, it will go just a bit further, and I'll pin it just to the end, and then I'll show you the next step, but I'll do that first with the camera off. Actually, before I do that, I will just show you how much bias that square from earlier on made. Can you see we've got all of this from that funny trapezium shaped bit of fabric. One seam, so it's really easy. You sew one seam, quite a small stitch, and then you cut a spiral, and that's it really. I've made it so the finished width is 3 centimeters. That gives me 1 centimeter for the seam, 1 centimeter to come past the seam, and then a little bit to sew down afterwards, which is quite handy. You could go a bit less. You probably wouldn't want to go at much more because it will get in the way then. Right, I've got 3 of them actually now pinned. It's taken me about 10-15 minutes to do 3 of them, and you'll see I have raw edges together, and you can just see here what I meant about having a bubble of fabric. Because it's on the bias, that will press out, but it means that outside edge sits much flatter. Where it's straighter, there's less pins. Where it's curved around the neck, there's more pins. I've pinned at about 1 centimeter so that I'm pinning where I'm going to be sewing to control the fullness. And then when there's not much going on, there's not many pins. And if you look at the back, you can see I've got pins just holding that in place. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to machine from this side. I'll start with my needle in here, and I will machine along this line, and then 1 centimeter seam distance as the rest, all the way around, staying on this side and being careful around the curves. You can see here where I've pinned it and got those little bubbles of ease in. This actually sits quite flat, so it shouldn't be too difficult to sew. And where I've clipped it, it's not too bulky either. So I will stitch those quickly, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. I finished the machining now, and you can see that we've got these 2 bits are separate but stitched really closely together. Where we had these bubbles that we pinned in on the neck curve, you can see the bubbles on the neck side, but where the seam is, it's completely flat, and that was really why I was pinning there. And this bit is almost sitting flat, which is really good. If we look at the other side, there's rather a lot of thread there, which I'll tidy up. You can see that the stitching starts and finishes at that cross again, and that will give you a much neater finish. I have to say it was much easier stitching, and I'm being lazy because I'm doing the blue ones at the same time. I'm batch sewing as you would batch cooking. I've not changed the threads, which is a bit lazy, but it does mean that it's much easier to do this because you can see exactly where it is. Having done that, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press this. It's polycotton, so I will have to be a little bit careful. I can't do it quite as hot as I would cotton. I will press it flat on all the stitching lines. That makes it much easier for the next bit. Once I've pressed it flat, I'm just going to snip into these really curved areas so that they will turn better. So sharp scissors and just snip into the seam point. Then once I've done that, I will press again, and I'll press this so it comes in. The other thing I'll do, which is sounds a bit weird, but I'll press this bit separately and stretch it a bit at the same time, just where it's going around the corner. I'll use the tip of my iron and a bit of steam, and as the iron is down, I will literally stretch it and press it at the same time. What that will do, it will give me a bit more length at the edge here, which makes it easier for the next step. And I'll do that on both these curvy bits, because if you look at them at the moment, they're just rolling up a little bit there, and that's going to distort the neck unless I can get a bit more length there. And so I'll use the iron to do that, and then I'll come back again. I finished the pressing now. As you can see, I've got this pressed flat on both sides. You might just be able to see that edge is a bit wavier than it was where I've stretched it. And then, oh sorry, one thing worth mentioning is it helps to make sure that there is no threads between these two, so that where one lot of stitching starts, it's just on one of the strips and the other one finishes just on the other strip. Makes this next bit much easier. So having pressed it, it really then is a question of turning it in, and you can see you've got a really nice flat V there. There's no puckers, no wobbles. I could have done it with that other colour. You can barely see it. At the top here, I have just cut with the tip of my scissors as far as the seam allowance, and that then gives that seam allowance a chance to spread, so that that will tuck in beautifully, and that will lie really nice and flat with the tiniest, oh no, it's a shadow actually, there isn't the hint of the underneath colour. The back of this is fairly tidy really. You've got where the two cross over, and generally what I do is I stitch across that a couple of times. It's all on the bias, so it's not going to fray, and actually it looks pretty tidy. If you were a perfectionist, which I'm not, you could machine down the fold across in a little diamond and then cut it all off. But as I say, I usually just stitch across, stitch across there to keep it all together. The final thing really, which I won't bother waiting on this to show you, is that I'm going to top stitch this in place, and you can see where we've got the 3 inches this finished one was, we've got the seam allowance, it turns over, that's nicely encased, and I'll probably do my top stitching at 1 centimetre away. I will just check the measurements on that strip. So that was the finished one. I've got a tape measure here. The finished width of it is 1.25 inches. So yes, that's right, I remember now. I cut it at 2.5 inches using one of these, which is really useful. So 2.5 inches, folded, pressed 1.25 inches, and then that gives you just enough. If it was too wide, you'd have trouble getting it to lie down nicely round these corners. If it was too narrow, it could go a bit narrower. I mean, you want it to cover that easily, so probably 2 inches would have done it, but this just is that bit easier to handle. So there you go, a V-neck. It's, as I say, not the only way to do a V-neck, but I found that it's actually quite a quick way of doing it once you get the knack really of pinning around the curves. I think is the most important thing. I've just started using wonder clips, but I think pins give you that bit more control on these bits. You could use wonder clips down here, but where you've got the tight curves, then pins really do work much better. I hope you find this useful. Thanks, bye.